and welcome to the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashan De Silva. Today on the Jazz Update, we're talking about the life and times and best hits of jazz icon Eric Dolphy. Eric was a clarinet, flute, and saxophone whiz. He rose to prominence in the 60s alongside other jazz greats of his time. Among his accolades, he was one of the first pioneers in bass clarinet playing in jazz and one of the greatest improvisers on the instrument. His improvisational style was wild and creative and won him a name as a very innovative improviser on the clarinet. Dolphy's playing was a blend of avant-garde and free jazz. Critics have said of his work that it was too out to be in and too in to be out. So Dolphy grew up in Los Angeles, graduating from Los Angeles City College. Started out performing in local bands, most notably the Roy Porter Big Band. His big break came when he was invited to perform alongside the Chico Hamilton Quintet, with whom he toured and performed until 1958. He then settled down in New York City, where his fame grew. He started collaborating with more jazz greats like Charles Mingus and John Coltrane in his New York City performances. His music was very controversial. People were divided on his unique style of playing at the time. He died in 1964, leaving behind a legacy as one of the most innovative clarinet players in jazz. So today on the Jazz Update, it's all about Eric Dolphy, his life and times and best hits. And this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashan De Silva. We'll be right back after some music. Stay tuned. And welcome back to the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashan De Silva. On this week's episode, it's about the life and times and best hits of jazz icon Eric Dolphy, and now it's time to talk about his biography. So, Eric Dolphy was a bass clarinet player, flutist, and composer. He started out in Los Angeles, where he toured in local clubs. He was one of the first clarinet players who showed that the bass clarinet was viable as a jazz instrument. On his early recordings, we see him playing a B-flat clarinet. He had a unique style of play that utilized things like speech-like effects on his clarinet, wide interval leaps, and exotic scales. Dolphy often said that his unique style was rooted in an unorthodox use of harmony. Many critics have compared his playing style to that of another jazz legend, Ornette Coleman. His first big break came in 1958 when he signed up with the Chico Hamilton Quintet. He toured with them excessively for a couple of years, gaining widespread recognition. He left the band in 1959 and settled in New York City. There's also a film of his performances with the Chico Hamilton Quintet called Jazz on a Summer's Day. It was aired during the Newport Jazz Festival in 1958. Shortly after leaving the Chico Hamilton Quintet, he partnered with Charles Mingus Band. He appeared on two favorite Mingus albums, Charles Mingus Presents Charles Mingus and Mingus. He also toured alongside Mingus in Europe in the early 60s. One of the highlights from his Europe tours was an album compilation called Dolphy in Europe Volumes 1, 2 and 3. Another iconic partnership was with John Coltrane. The two of them would regularly discuss ideas and innovations. Dolphy ended up signing up with John Coltrane's big band in 1961. One of his iconic performances alongside Coltrane was recorded in an album series called The Complete 1961 Village Vanguard Recordings. Around this time, he started to veer away from his typical hard bop style, which gained both critics and fans alike. He started his own recording career as a band leader in 1961 with the Prestige label. He released 13 albums with this label from 1960 to 1961. Two of his iconic albums from this time include his hit albums Outward Bound and Out There. 1964, he saw another big album release with Out to Lunch, released on Blue Note Records. An album full of exciting, unpredictable solo performances by Dolphy, and one of his best albums from the avant-garde jazz format. This album was also instrumental in the development of jazz music in general, and continues to inspire future generations with its complex technicalities. Another highlight of Dolphy's playing style was his use of unaccompanied saxophone solos after the style of Coleman Hawkins, who popularized this style of saxophone playing in the 40s. He uses his technique in several albums, like his album Far Cry and his European album compilations. He was also a big fan of classical music. He was inspired by the works of classical composers like Alban Berge and Charles Ives, among others. Eric Dolphy died in 1964, leaving behind a legacy as a clarinet player who shaped the face of jazz for eons to come. So that was a bit of insight into Eric Dolphy's biography, and this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashan De Silva. And welcome back to the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashan De Silva. On this week's episode, it's about Eric Dolphy's life and times and best albums, and now it's time to talk about some promo news. There's a new album set to be released. It's called Milton plus Esperanza, and it's due for release on May 6th. This album is a collaboration between two star artists, Grammy Award-winning Esperanza Spalding and Milton Nascimento. So this album is a Brazilian jazz-themed rendition compilation. Contains renditions of classics like the Beatles' A Day in the Life, Michael Jackson's Earth Song, and more. There's also some of the artist's own compositions. 5 of the songs on this album are taken from her previous album releases. There's also a star-studded lineup to the album. Paul Simon, Diane Reeves, Tim Bernardes, Carolina Shorter, Shabaka Hutchins, and more. Nascimento and Spalding are on vocals. For more information, please visit www.found.e/Milton-Esperanza. So that was a bit of trending promo news right there, and this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashan Silva. We're going for a short break. We'll be right back after that. When we come back, we're going to be talking about some of Eric Dolphy's best albums of all time. Stay tuned. And welcome back to the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashan Silva. On this week's episode, it's about the life and times and best hits of jazz icon Eric Dolphy. And on this hour, we're going to be talking about some of his best albums of all time. The first album is called Out to Lunch, released in 1964 on Blue Note Records. This one's one of Eric's best efforts in the bop genre. Some of the standout tracks from this album include Hat and Beard, Something Sweet, Something Sweet, Something Tender, and Gazzelloni. These were all original compositions by Dolphy. Another album called Far Cry, released on the Prestige label in 1961, another all-time favorite from the hard bop genre, a mellow and relaxing album. And an album called Outward Bound, released on the Prestige label in 1960. This one's an amazing bop album. It especially showcases Dolphy's acumen as a band leader. Also, this album is an example of jazz music that played a role in the development of jazz in the 60s. In this album, Dolphy wrote most of the songs. There's also a few classics here like On Green Dolphin Street and Miss Tony. So that was a quick recap of some of the albums we're going to be discussing on this hour. And this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashan Silva. We'll be right back after some music. Stay tuned. And welcome back to the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashan Silva. On this week's episode, it's about the life and times and best hits of jazz icon Eric Dolphy. And on this hour, we're going to be talking about some of his best albums of all time. The first album is called Out to Lunch, released in 1964 on Blue Note Records. This was one of Eric's best albums, a magnus opus in avant-garde jazz. Some of the standout tracks from this album: a tribute to Thelonious Monk, Hat and Beard, a very aptly titled Something Sweet, Something Tender, a jaunty flute showcase called Gazzelloni, and a swinging song called Straight Up and Down. These were all original compositions by Dolphy. And Dolphy was also famous for his uncanny interval leaps, time signatures, and innovative use of tonality. So all these unique facets of his playing style make an appearance in this album. And then there's the album's background soundscapes, which are completely mesmerizing. And then there's Dolphy on his solos, angular dissonant melodies. His bandmates fit the mood perfectly. The freedom his playing style gives is perfect for the styles of the rest of his band. His band comprised of vibraphonist Bobby Hutcherson, bassist Richard Davis, and drummer Tony Williams. Bobby Hutcherson is one of the highlights with his flawless piano accompaniments. He weaves in and out of Dolphy's wind instrument playing with his nostalgic floating piano melodies. Another highlight of Dolphy's clarinet playing is how he mimics a stuttering vocal effect with his clarinet, oddly placed pauses, and all that makes his bass clarinet lines sound like they're tripping over themselves. Overall, a wild and enthralling compilation of hits. Another album called Far Cry, released on the Prestige label in 1961. This was Dolphy's final album before he started out playing alongside John Coltrane and Charles Mingus in New York City. Another all-time favorite album from the hard bop genre. It's more mellow and relaxing than Out to Lunch, which was released a few years prior. Dolphy is on alto sax, bass clarinet and flute. Brooker Little is on trumpet. So one of the highlights on this album is the song Ode to Charlie Parker. That's a beautiful flute and trumpet melody. On the first couple of tracks, there's Brooker Little with his epic trumpet playing, and then Brooker's trumpet gives way to Dolphy's clarinet melodies. And then on, it's one of the most epic bunch of Dolphy solos ever recorded. One highlight is his clarinet playing on the song Magic. On this track, he shows his ability to stretch a melody without changing it. One of his best albums of all time. Another album called Outward Bound, also released on Prestige in 1960. This one's an amazing bop album, especially showcases Dolphy's acumen as a band leader. Now there was a difference between Dolphy and other jazz pioneers of the time like Ornette Coleman. The first school of thought wanted to change the face of jazz from outside to add to what was already there. Dolphy's school of thought wanted to change the music from within, maintaining the melodies he played while adding his own unique flavor to the music. So in this sense, this album is similar to John Coltrane style albums as a pioneer in jazz development through jazz classics at the time. It was also Dolphy's first album as band leader. Also another contrast, Coltrane typically played renditions of the Great American Songbook, a compilation of classics from down the timeline of jazz. In this album, Dolphy wrote most of the songs. There's also a few classics here like On Green Dolphin Street and Miss Tony. The album starts off with a fast-paced track. Background instrumentals provide the bop beats while Dolphy takes center stage with clarinet solos. Another highlight from the album, his flute playing on Glad to Be Unhappy by Rodgers and Hart. This melody alternates between flat and mournful to happy and swinging. George Tucker anchors the whole performance with his bass playing. Roy Haynes displays great versatility on his drums as he alternates between rapid, wild playing on the track Lay 1 Minute and gentle playing on the track On Green Dolphin Street. Freddie Hubbard was just starting out with this album, but he shows great skill even at that early stage. So overall, this album is a showcase both of jazz innovations at the time and the unique styles that made each of the players in this performance the legends that they would become. And welcome back to the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashan De Silva. On this week's episode, it's about Eric Dolphy's life and times and best albums, and now it's time to talk about some promo news. So there's another jazz album set to be released, Dawn is a Melody. This album is the work of Australian-based pianist Finn Rees. This is his debut long-play album. It's set to be released May 31st on Bongo Imprint Records UK. So the theme of this album is nostalgic piano music by Finn and his band. Speaking about the album, Rees said, "My intention with Dawn is a Melody was to create a world, a microcosm of color, something rich and beautiful that allowed the melodies and compositions to reach their full potential." And this album reflects that sentiment. It's full of themes like striving for success and hope in an ever-changing world. So this album takes nostalgic memories from the past and turns them into music, with Finn in collaboration with some of Melbourne's leading jazz talent. Songs are inspired by other jazz legends from Alice Coltrane to Arthur Verocai. For more information, please visit bfan.link/expansion. So that was a bit of trending promo news right there, and this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashan De Silva. We're going for a short break. We'll be right back after that. When we come back, we're going to be talking about some of Eric Dolphy's best albums of all time. Stay tuned.